So, Michael Beth, so far we've got some sense of the whole Gospel of Matthew and some of its concerns. We've wrestled a little bit with the great sermon and all of its complexity. And now we've moved on a little bit to the next chunk, where there's a focus also on another discourse of Jesus, the second of the five. And this is a commissioning discourse, right, where he sends out his disciples. What's going on in this discourse, and how does it relate to the context?
I think first we can point to some of the connections between what's gone before and what happens here in chapter 10. I think the overarching theme is Jesus' authority. So especially in chapters 8 and 9, we've just seen him performing miracles and showing his authority in that way. And then in chapter 10, he invites his disciples into this kind of work, the inauguration of the kingdom through miracles. And really he's saying, you are to go out and do the very work that I've been doing over these past few chapters in Matthew. And that's a thematic connection with what's come before, but there are also some interesting linguistic connections, I think. You know, at the end of chapter 9, he says, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. So you should pray for workers, for laborers to come. And then chapter 10 starts off with them being sent out as those laborers. And I sort of like to think that, you know, perhaps they did pray that God would do something, and then the answer was,
go do it.
Go do it, exactly. How often does that happen? So Jesus is sending his 12 disciples out to imitate him, to do what he has been doing. I think that's the connection with what's come before.
Is part of the invitation here to embrace a life of voluntary poverty? You're not supposed to take anything with you on this journey,
right? He says, don't take money, don't take a bag, etc. And certainly, you know, early Christians and even Christians today have read these passages that way, as though voluntary poverty is what Jesus is commending for all disciples. But as we've said, I think Matthew is also, he's not rejecting that view, of course. He's incorporating it into his picture of discipleship. But he also is writing for a community that is more urban, that is staying where they are in their city. So I don't think that he is trying to say this is the only way to be a disciple is to embrace poverty. I think what matters most in this context is that they would make themselves vulnerable to the hospitality of the ones to whom they're going, to allow themselves to rely on the communities that they're going to preach and heal in. That's really what, for Matthew, is the most important piece of this.
I remember reading Paul, too. Paul worries a little bit about whether people should be paid for their missionary service, right?
Right.
Is that possibly part of the background?
I think so. I think this is part of what early Christians are wrestling with, is this question of, right, should they be paid for their services? Should they work on the side and be doing this mission sort of on their own? Should they be embracing voluntary poverty? And I think we should also say that voluntary poverty was not by any means a Christian invention. You know, we know that the Cynic philosophers, for example, were traveling around the ancient world and begging, and that was a part of how they sustained themselves. So I think, you know, in the ancient world, that was not unheard of. But again, I think that Jesus is telling his disciples that they can and should rely on the hospitality of the community.
One other dimension of this mission discourse is that there are limits placed on mission, right? The disciples are not supposed to go to the Samaritans or Gentiles or anything of that nature. And then at the end of the gospel, we hear this great commission to go out and preach the gospel to all nations and teach them as they were taught. What do you make of that difference, that tension?
It does seem sort of strange. Jesus says, only go to Israel. But then, of course, at the end, he says, go make disciples of all nations. So I think it does seem strange. But I think what it reflects is more a trajectory of salvation history, that there's this idea that God came first to the people of Israel and then to the Gentiles. And in chapter 8, Jesus himself goes into Gentile territory. So he's not saying never go to the Gentiles. I think it's more a matter of two stages. Go first to the people of Israel, and then eventually we'll get to those.
And we did see in even those opening chapters of Matthew these hints that there were Gentiles on the horizon, and the mission of this community has a more universal scope ultimately, even though it might go in several stages.
So in a sense, the gospel itself is bookended by these pictures of Gentiles being incorporated into the people of God, because we have it in the genealogy in the very beginning, and then we have it at the end with Jesus' Great Commission. So there's that.
So again, Matthew might be trying to make some theological sense of the developments that actually took place during the first century, starting out within Israel, within a Jewish environment, and then branching out eventually. We mentioned Paul as someone who might be on the horizon here, and I've wondered, going back to the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is supposed to have said anybody who teaches that the law is abrogated is the least in the kingdom of heaven. Might that be a side swipe toward someone like Paul?
Could be. I know some scholars have read this as evidence of a Peter-Paul sort of dichotomy in early Christian communities, that those who followed Peter disagreed with those who followed Paul, and that there were these sort of two camps. And what I take away from it is the knowledge that early Christian communities were debating precisely these issues, and that disagreements within early Christian communities are part of what led to the development of their beliefs about how to behave and who Jesus was. So I think often we lament disagreement, or we fear disagreement within Christian communities, but I think from the very beginning, Christians have wrestled with what the truth is and what it means for our lives.
We saw that in connection with the divorce saying that we found in the Sermon on the Mount. Yeah, it's interesting to think about the Gospel of Matthew, which has often been portrayed as the gospel of the church in a way that's almost hierarchical and rigid in terms of its structures, but then as soon as you begin to probe in the way that we have here, you see that Matthew is involved in some of the debates that were clearly going on in Christian circles in the first century and trying to negotiate something in those debates, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Well, the disciples are told here that things might not always go well when they go out in their ministry. What do you think is going on with that?
Yeah. I mean, Jesus tells them, well, I think he gives them two things to expect. First, expect opposition. He says, there will absolutely be negative responses to your going out and preaching and healing in my name. There will be persecution. Just expect that. But then more towards the end, he also says, expect strength from God as your means of enduring that opposition. So it's twofold. It's a warning that they will face difficulties, but then it's also a promise that they won't be alone in that God will give them not only the words that they need when they're put on trial, but also the strength to persevere. And also the promise that vindication will come. It just will be God's, and it will come later.
Yeah, we haven't thought too much about that motif of judgment and vindication, but we're going to see it more as the gospel develops. This again reminds me of Paul, who's often talking about how difficult it is being an apostle, and somehow he takes strength from that very fact that he's in difficulty and boasts about it, right?
Right.
So an interesting parallel. There's something of an eschatological horizon to this. In chapter 10, verse 23, Jesus says that the disciples won't finish going around to all the towns in Israel before the Son of Man comes.
Yeah.
What's going on with that?
Yeah. Well,
what is the eschatological horizon?
Some have read this as Jesus saying, I will come back. This will be my second coming, and it will happen very soon. I don't think that's what is going on here for a couple of reasons. One, this Son of Man phrase is famously ambiguous. In some places, it is connected to the end times, in Daniel, for example. But so far in Matthew, it has not been used in that way. So far in Matthew, it's only been used as, Jesus uses it as something of a circumlocution to refer to himself or to another prophetic figure. So I don't think that Matthew is priming his readers to view this as an eschatological statement. I think rather that Jesus is promising that he will come and help them. They won't be left alone in their mission. He will eventually come, and he's not sending them off by themselves, never to see them again. And of course, this is what happens in the narrative itself. They are reunited. So I think it's part of his promise. Not only will you receive what you need to endure from God, but you will receive my help in this mission as well.
Interesting methodological point there. That is that some people read this text against a larger background of eschatological expectations that's in evidence in other Gospels, in sure. Mark certainly, where there are clear allusions, and there will be in Matthew later on to Daniel. But also against this literary fact that the Son of Man can be used as a circumlocution for himself by Jesus, right? And so this could have a reference within the narrative and not to some larger theological frame. Right. Yeah, interesting point. There's something else about this description of life for disciples that it's not always going to go well with family life. That's another element of the Jesus tradition, right? Although we often associate Christianity with a strong emphasis on family life and the like. Family values, right. Yes. Jesus often has some harsh things to say about families. What do you make of what's going on here?
He does. He says he's bringing a sword, right? Not come to bring peace, which is seems somewhat strange to fit with our picture of Jesus. I think we mentioned before Jesus' use of hyperbole. I think that for Jesus, really, the question is about loyalty, and that loyalty to Jesus trumps anything else that we might find important, and that of course is important. But we see this again and again in the call stories. He calls his disciples to leave their families behind. He reorients biological kinship in terms of spiritual kinship. He refers throughout Matthew to his disciples as his children. He uses familial language to, I think, create a sense of a spiritual family and to redirect understandings of loyalty, especially in the ancient world where kinship ties were so important on so many levels. Jesus is shifting their understanding of where their loyalty should lie, I think. So the sword is cutting family ties in a sense.
Yeah, interesting to keep in mind when we think about contemporary debates about family values, right, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah. Do you think that they focus on mission here in chapter 10 is the same as Matthew's general focus on what the church should be about?
Yes and no. I think that Matthew lays out several markers of Christian disciples that I think it can be very helpful for us to ask, are these markers of the church today? For example, they face persecution. They face opposition. They don't hold on to their possessions. They rely on the hospitality of others. They, of course, proclaim the gospel and work for the good of the oppressed and the sick and the marginalized in society. So all of these, I think, are markers of Christian community and ultimately of the church. But this isn't the only thing Matthew says about the church either. I think the other discourses also should contribute to our picture of what the church should be. We've already talked about the Sermon on the Mount. Later, Jesus talks about the governance of Christian community. So I think the larger picture is a fuller picture of what the church is and should be.
Yeah, we don't have time to go into it in great detail, but there's one other little bit that might be worth thinking about here. In chapter 11, Jesus portrays himself in interesting ways. What's going on with that?
Yeah, in chapter 11, we come back to that wisdom motif that we mentioned before. He says, wisdom is proved right by her actions. So again, I think that for Matthew, there's a focus on behavior, and behavior being aligned with what you say and what you say you believe. So wisdom is proven by behavior. So it's not just, I think it's a reflection on who Jesus is. He's portraying himself as this figure of wisdom that would have been very familiar in Jewish tradition. But he's also saying something about those who seek after wisdom and want to live in a way that follows Jesus, the figure of wisdom, as well.
Yeah, this ties in with what we were talking about in terms of the church and its mission and the complexity of that.
Yeah.
All right, well, I think we've dealt with the mission discourse.
Great.